Okay, well, welcome everybody to our May Fireside Chat on managing forest density. We advertise this as a topic specifically on the silvicultural concept of relative density, but that can get a little bit arcane, and so I'm gonna back up and talk a little more generally just about forest density, how to manage density, and kind of work our way into the topic of relative density. Since a lot of people that attend these fireside chats don't have a background in silviculture, what I'm going to try to do is put everything into terms that hopefully you can go and apply directly in your woods without too much more academic research. Um, if you are new to these fireside chats, we host these every month. They cover a broad range of topics relating to small woodland management. Typically, we have about a half-hour presentation, and then we turn it over to the group for group discussion, either questions about the topic or sharing anecdotes related to the topic. This presentation might go a little bit longer, just kind of given the nature of the topic, but we'll endeavor to save some time at the end where we can answer questions and again, just have a general conversation. If questions come up during the presentation, please put them into the chat function down at the bottom of your screen. And when we're done with the presentation, Lauren will take a look through those questions. We'll field them first and then open it up for general discussion. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And Lauren, can you confirm again that that's working?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, awesome. Well, so again, this is going to be a topic about forest density, not the main question that my wife asks me every evening just before bed. Um, but I am Norwegian and a little thick-headed, so very capable of running on the denser side of things. But this is about forest density, not Kirk Hanson's density. What I'm going to be talking about over the next half hour here, we're going to talk a little bit about forest stand growth and development to give you some context for how forests develop. We're going to talk a little bit about the rationale for managing stand density. And then I want to give you some observable biological clues for when a stand may be too dense and you may want to think about starting to thin. And we're going to talk a little bit about some basic thinning considerations and then finally get into some guidelines on how to determine optimal stand density and what you should be thinning down to keep your forests in optimal growth. So first, let's just start with some kind of basic forest development 101. Exposed soils, in particular in our climate, quickly become colonized by vegetation so as to maximize the capture of incoming solar energy. This drives rapid growth, and as soon as a site is fully colonized, whether it's with brush or trees or both, the vegetation goes into a competitive growth phase wherein individual plants or trees compete with one another for increasingly limited sunlight. And once the canopy closes on a forest, the ensuing growth phase is often referred to as the stem exclusion phase, as you'll see in this diagram, which can last for decades, even well over 100 years. I was just up in the Lake Whatcom watershed near Bellingham, the city of Bellingham, northern Washington, looking at some stands that were 110, 114 years old, still extremely dense and in this competitive exclusion or stem exclusion phase. So this is obviously a Douglas fir plantation. This is on my family's land near Bakota, and it's a classic example of a stand that's in the stem exclusion phase. This stand originated before my family bought the property, probably planted, at a standard stocking of 300 to 400 trees per acre. And since its origination, it experienced a high survival rate, so still stocked at a very high density. The canopy has been closed for several years, and since Douglas fir is only moderately shade tolerant, the increasingly dense canopy is resulting in the die off of lower branches and receding crowns, as well as limited understory vegetation that's often dominated by one or two species. In this case, sword fern and salal, a little bit drier site. Red alder commonly colonizes disturbed soils, and particularly slightly wetter soils, if there are seed trees in the area. And colonization typically occurs at very, very high densities. This stand, also on my family's Bakota land, is probably over 600 trees per acre,
Mm.
but shares a lot of characteristics similar to the Douglas fir plantation in that it's dominated by a single species. Since alder also is not particularly shade tolerant, it's self-limbing beneath the dense canopy. And it as well has a really limited understory that's also dominated by just a couple species. I think in this case, salmonberry and sword fern. But like I mentioned, even in older stands comprised of really large trees, this is about 110-year-old stand of Douglas fir up in the Lake Whatcom watershed. Likely naturally regenerated after the original old growth was cut, regenerated at a high density, has been in the stem exclusion phase for 100 plus years, self-thinning, and again, structurally, similar to these much younger stands, dominated by a single species, self-limbing again, limited understory vegetation, limited diversity. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about why we should be thinking about thinning some of these stands that arguably are stocked at a very high density. And of course, it's always going to come down to the objectives of the landowner, which can vary widely. You may thin to improve timber growth and quality. If you have small diameter overstock stands, you might be thinning to reduce fire risk and grow larger, more fire resistant trees. Highly stocked stands can be very susceptible to all sorts of different natural disturbance agents, storms, disease, pests, insect pests. So you may want to thin to improve forest resilience or forest health, just increase the vigor of the trees. Maybe you want to thin to increase wildlife habitat. Those examples that I just showed you, very homogeneous stands with very little structural diversity, very little understory diversity for forage for wildlife. So you may want to thin to increase forage and wildlife structures. You may want to thin for aesthetics. Might just look better to have a stand comprised of fewer, larger trees, well spaced out, obviously entirely subjective. You may also want to thin to improve carbon sequestration and really more so the ability of a forest to maintain carbon in a stable fashion. Highly overstocked stands are very, again, subject to disturbance. And even though they may be optimizing carbon sequestration, they may not be able to hold that carbon in a resilient fashion, if a big storm comes along and knocks down that stand. And there's an old adage, room to grow and none to waste. So, if your objective is optimizing, either timber growth or carbon sequestration, you really want to be probably looking at optimizing, again, the photosynthetic potential of that site. And that's going to involve, thinning and focusing those resources, both sunlight, soil moisture, on fewer trees. So let's get into some of the observable biological clues for when a stand is overstocked. This particular stand, might be arguably fully occupied, but again, this stand is extremely dense. The trees are really tall, they're skinny. Individual trees are competing for each other, so they're all growing up trying to get to the sunlight. And although carbon sequestration is being optimized in a stand like this, timber growth and quality isn't. As the trees remain really small diameter for a long period of time until this stand thins itself out. Um, Stands like this are really susceptible to storm damage, as the tall and skinny trees are prone to snapping and noodling or blowing over. And further, stands in a highly competitive growth phase like this, in particular monocultures, again, are more prone to disease, insects, fire, which all could compromise the long-term carbon storage in a forest like this, again, if that's one of your objectives. So this is where I want to introduce the concept of height to diameter, or the height to diameter ratio, HDR. Comes into play very, very nicely in stands like this. And it's our first kind of observable and measurable biological clue for determining whether a stand is too dense or not. So the HDR, the height to diameter ratio of a tree, indicates how susceptible a tree is to storm damage or simply weak growth that's prone to noodling over. And you can calculate the height to diameter ratio by measuring a tree's diameter in feet. So typically we measure DBH, or diameter breast height, in inches, but you can measure it in inches, but you want to convert it to feet. And then you divide the total tree height in feet by the diameter in feet to get that height to diameter ratio. So for instance, if we have a tree that's 14 inches tall, see if I can get my pointer working here, uh, 14 inches tall, and it's 100, so that's 1.2 feet in diameter. It's 110 feet tall. We're going to divide 110 by 1.2 and get 92, or a 92 to 1 height to diameter ratio. And generally, trees that are over an 80 to 1 height to diameter ratio are considered very, very unstable within a stand. And if you have an entire stand of trees like this, like the one in the picture, again, that stand's very susceptible to different disturbance agents, in particular storms. So the second observable biological clue for when to cut a tree or thin a stand is something called the live crown ratio. And the live crown ratio is defined as the percent of a tree's total height with living branches and needles or leaves. So the live crown of a tree is its growth engine, right? And as the crown recedes, typically due to canopy competition, the growth of the tree slows. So trees with small live crowns often become subordinate in a stand. They just can't compete with the more dominant trees that have larger crowns. And they ultimately end up suppressed beneath the canopy of the forest of more dominant trees, or they may die off entirely. So generally speaking, trees that have live crowns that exceed 40% of their total height are considered to be in an optimal growth phase. Conversely, trees that have less than 30% live crowns express a very stunted growth. So from a thinning standpoint, when you're looking at live crowns, let me back up a little bit. In a homogeneous stand, Douglas fir plantation, this would be true for a naturally regenerated alder stand. You may want to focus on the average live crown of the dominant and co-dominant trees. In this picture, those are the ones that are labeled D and C, as those are likely the trees that you'll want to retain long term. Although the intermediate and suppressed trees, the trees that have I or an S, will likely have less than 30% crowns. You may want to wait to thin until the average live crowns, again, of the dominant and co-dominant trees recede below 40%. That just kind of keeps the overall stand in optimal growth kind of up to, I don't want to say the last minute, but up to the point where it's then kind of optimal to thin that stand. So you're not thinning too soon, in other words. In a mixed species stand, you may either look at the average live crown across the stand, all of the trees, or at the live crown ratio of individual trees and use kind of an individual tree selection to pull those trees out that essentially are already getting thinned out or weeded out through canopy competition. So the whole point of this usually is to kind of skip over this competitive exclusion or stem exclusion phase by proactively thinning and again favoring resources, focusing resources on the remaining trees. So there's many different strategies for thinning a stand. That could be a whole fireside chat unto itself. Um, and of course, thinning, how you thin, tree selection, what you keep, what you take is going to be entirely up to your own objectives. But I'm just going to walk you through a few examples more for the value of the thought process. And I think these illustrations are fairly informative for both homogeneous stands and mixed stands if we give it a little bit of interpretation. So starting with this unthinned stand, where there are visible and measurable signs of excessive competition, live crowns are beginning to recede, you may conduct a light thinning where you just maybe take out a few of the dominant trees, but you're really leaving the vast majority of the dominant trees, but focusing your thinning on the intermediate and suppressed trees, like I had just mentioned earlier. This is going to free up resources overall for the dominant, co-dominant trees. And you might leave, some of those understory trees if they have, still more than 40% live crown. If they happen to occupy a little bit of a gap in the canopy, what have you. That way you get some structural diversity in that stand, and you're not just pushing it towards, again, a very homogeneous canopy composition. You might also do a moderate thinning, where again you take out maybe a few more of the dominant trees, but now you're really pulling out a lot more of the intermediate suppressed trees, co-dominant trees. Again, really trying to focus more of the resources on those dominant trees. Or you may do a heavy thinning, cut out really all of the competition, making sure each of the retained trees, usually the dominant trees, have ample room in the canopy for their crowns to spread out and continue to grow. The latter is probably going to really be more for the folks that are about optimizing timber production and again focusing all the site's resources on those trees. The other thinning strategies are more about creating structurally diverse stands. Then, of course, there's many more variations of thinning. I mean, you could thin heavily across the dominant trees in the canopy to release understory cohorts. You can focus on either removing or retaining specific species of trees, maybe pulling alder out of the stand if it's getting a little too old, so you can capture its value, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to shift now to discussion of getting into a little more of the weeds about density and get into some guidelines for determining optimal stand density. And we often refer to forest density in two different ways, absolute density and relative density. Now, absolute density is the number of trees per unit of area. Okay, it's typically expressed as trees per acre. For instance, we'll oftentimes plant a new plantation at 300 trees per acre or 400 trees per acre. Absolute density can also be expressed in basal area or timber volume. In other words, these are all directly measurable values. They're absolute values. Relative density indicates how fully occupied a site is and is a relationship between average stand diameter and trees per acre. And I'll get into relative density here in a little bit. And in its simplest form, relative density is expressed on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is an unoccupied site and 100 is the potential maximum density for a particular species. and where extreme mortality is taking place because of that very high density. So let's start with absolute density and trees per acre as a guide for stand density. First of all, one of I think, the most useful guidelines I've found for determining optimal stand density is the USDA's Forest Stand Density Guide. And if you just Google that name of that publication, it'll pop up right away. And it has this really handy table in there that organizes tree species based on their shade tolerance and diameter, and then provides density ranges and tree spacing for optimal growth. So let's take Douglas fir as an example. The recommended reforestation density, taking a look at the first column here, column B, you're replanting a site. The recommended minimum reforestation density is 11 by 11 or 360 trees per acre. So 11 by 11 foot spacing translates to 360 trees per acre. And we've established that density, or set that density, because that is the minimum density to, if you have good survival, to quickly colonize a site and again get that stand optimizing the photosynthetic potential and growth potential of the site. So then as that stand grows up and gets into what we call a young stand density, where the diameters now are anywhere from 2 to 9 inches in diameter at breast height. This is usually the age and size of trees when we're going to consider pre-commercial thinning. According to this chart, not quite there yet. You want to be thinning that stand, you can see right here, to an 11 to 13 foot spacing, which translates to 258 to 360 trees per acre. Oftentimes within these Douglas fir plantations, by the time they reach this age, other trees have seeded in there. It could be alder, hemlock, cedar, what have you, whatever seed trees. So you'll have you may have a higher stocking density in this young stand age than you started out with. Hence this thinning range of 258 to 360 trees per acre. And I'm going to talk about the D plus rule here for larger trees in a little bit. So let's take a look at a different example. So Douglas fir is considered a moderately shade tolerant tree, but let's take a look at Western red cedar, a very shade tolerant tree. So here now the minimum reforestation is 9 by 9 versus the 11 by 11 for Douglas fir, which translates to about 538 trees per acre. So you can plant cedar at a much higher density, knowing that it's going to take a lot longer for it to grow up and get into a competitive growth phase. Similarly, when the cedar stand gets into a young stand phase, diameters averaging 2 to 9 inches, you can thin that to a little bit higher density than Douglas fir, 9 to 11 feet versus the 11 to 13 feet for Douglas fir. And 9 to 11 feet translates to 360 to 538 trees per acre. So one little side on this, you've got this range that you can thin down to, and I like that range. It gives the manager a lot of flexibility to adapt to site-specific considerations. And one thing we may want to keep in mind, depending on your site, in particular the exposure or how droughty your soils are, you may want to be thinning to the lower end of that range to help your stand be a little more resilient, either to climate change or, again, site-specific droughty conditions. That's one way that you can play with that stand density. Conversely, if you've got a wetter site, north-facing site, really productive soils, you can thin to the higher end of that density range. Okay, let's see. So let's talk now a little bit about the D plus rule. For trees that are larger than 10 inches in diameter, there's a simple density rule that we just call the D plus rule, where you take the average diameter within a stand in inches, and then you add a constant to it that's based on the shade tolerance of a tree and the productivity of the site. So you'll see here, again, this D plus 3 in the case of red cedar, all the way up to D plus 7 for red alder. So it's a lower number for the more shade tolerant trees and a higher number for the less shade tolerant trees. And this rule is explained in the USDA Forest Stand Density Guide also. So as I go through this explanation of D plus, if this gets a little confusing, look up that guide and you can read a little more about it there. So I want to give you an example. Let's take a Douglas fir stand where we've measured the average diameter of the stand at 12 inches. So if we take 12 for the 12 inches, but we're just saying 12, not inches in this case now, and we add the constant of 5, because Douglas fir, again, is a moderately shade-tolerant tree, we get 17. And that 17 now is expressed in feet. And that should be the average spacing between trees when you've thinned. So that's how that D plus rule works. And if we look up a trees per acre chart, an average spacing of 17 feet between trees translates to 150 trees per acre. So for instance, if you had done your pre-commercial thinning and had thinned this Douglas fir stand down to the 258 to 360 trees per acre that were recommended, and now your average diameter is 12 inches, you're going to be removing anywhere from 30 to 50% of the trees, again, taking it down to approximately 150 trees per acre, depending on the starting density and depending on the productivity of your site. And you can adjust that constant, that +5, again, based on site productivity. So like with my Bakota and Oakville forest, site class 2 soils, very productive soils, I might use a D plus 3 in that kind of case. So there's some flexibility with these numbers that you just have to use as you get more familiar with them. They'll make sense. Now, there's another way to interpret this D plus rule, and that's to compare the average distance between trees to the average diameter of the trees in the stand to determine when to thin. And the way this works is you determine the average diameter first, and again, then you apply a constant based on the shade tolerance of the tree, and again, convert this to feet, just like we did before. And if the average distance between the trees is less than this calculated number, your stand is too dense and you should consider thinning. So let's give an example of that. So let's say your Doug fir stand is averaging 10 inches in diameter. So we're going to take 10 plus 3, which is the constant, again, for a moderately shade tolerant, somewhat tolerant Douglas fir. We get 13 feet. And if you were to put in some plots in your stand and you've determined that your stand is running, say, 300 trees per acre, that translates to a tree again every 11 to about 11 feet or so, then again that stand is too dense. The D plus rule says that the average spacing should be 13 feet. But 300 trees per acre, if that's what you measure, is too dense, and you need to be doing a little bit of thinning to bring it down to an average spacing of 13 feet. So what this implies is you're going to have to get familiar with how to measure tree density within a plot. A common plot size is a 1/20th acre. That's 26.7 feet in radius. And so I recommend that everybody get a Spencer tape or a diameter tape that is calibrated on one side to measure tree circumference and convert that to diameter. And on the other side, it's distance. So you can start measuring these plots. And you put in a number of plots, and you get, an average density. Oops. For the site. And I also recommend that you just Google a tree spacing guide or a trees per acre guide, and this will tell you based on the trees per acre that you measure in your plot, what the average spacing would be. And I want to provide one caveat here and one aside. So we're talking about thinning down to these, average spacing between trees. And I think what I'll underscore there is that's an average spacing, not a constant spacing. Okay. Because we're going to be thinning for other criteria. We may want to be removing trees that have some defect if we're trying to improve timber quality. If you have two dominant, nice growing trees that are only 6 feet apart, have full, 40% plus crowns, you want to keep those. We often refer to this as variable density thinning. So these spacing between trees, again, are averages and really more a way to kind of think about trees per acre. So again, I recommend you all get familiar with putting in plots and measuring the number of trees within a plot. 20-acre plot, if you measure an average of 15 trees in there, it's 300 trees per acre. It's pretty basic. Let's see. So I think I just got to talk through all of that there. So again, if you've measured 300 trees per acre, and that distance then is 12 feet between trees, but the D+ rule says the distance should be 13 feet. That's telling you that you want to thin. So now I want to get into relative density and conclude with this. And another publication that I recommend that you look up online and download, it's a free publication from Oregon State University Extension titled Competition and Density in Woodland Stands. It's going to give a much, much broader explanation of the concept of relative density, and then also provide all of these handy charts I'll show you in a little bit that show the density at which different common tree species in the Northwest should be growing based on their average diameter. So again, relative density, and there's numerous different ways for calculating and working with the concept of relative density, but the simplest that I think is most accessible to layperson, again, is this kind of chart that's based on a scale of 0 to 100, where, again, the higher the number, the greater the competition within a stand. So if you look at this, again, the low number down here, 0, stand establishment. At about a relative density of, somewhere between 10 and 15, you get crown closure or canopy closure. And then you have this kind of optimal or full growth potential phase here, where the trees are growing just exuberantly. They're free to grow, full crowns, what have you. And then they grow into, and I love how OSU calls this the Goldilocks zone here, the zone of just, again, really superb growth, where you're getting a combination of good growth, but yet it's moderated a little bit, and the annual incremental growth is kind of moderated, so you're getting good timber quality as well as good timber volume production in this Goldilocks zone. But once at this point, the stand is closed canopy, competition is already beginning between the trees, but they have sufficient live crowns, still more than 40%, growing well. But as those trees get larger and competition gets more intense, that relative density gets up to around 50 or into the upper Goldilocks zone. That's when you want to think about thinning your stand. If you don't, then as those trees get bigger and the canopy gets more competitive, you get into the danger zone. And this is when mortality now begins happening. And you really get that differentiation between dominant, co-dominant, intermediate, and suppressed trees. And then you get to the zone that nobody wants to be in, the zone of no return. The stand is so dense that there is extreme mortality happening across the trees. Live crowns are likely well below 30%. And it's extremely difficult, in some cases, impossible to thin a stand like that and get the remaining trees to release. You thin it, and the trees are so tall and skinny that they fall over. So that's an extreme case. And as we get into the relative density charts, you'll see that they're also, again, based on the shade tolerance of trees, with the understanding that the more shade tolerant a tree is, the higher density it can grow at. And relative density, again, is the relationship between trees per acre and average diameter, as I'll show you in some charts coming up. And as I just mentioned, yeah, it's varies based on shade tolerance. So let's take an example here. Very shade tolerant tree, Western red cedar. And let's say you've got a stand of nearly pure cedar. And first of all, to show you how this chart's laid out. So you have trees per acre across the top. This is just showing 50 trees per acre all the way to 680 trees per acre. The bulk of this chart here are diameters. All of these numbers are diameters, and in particular the average diameter. And then, of course, you've got your different zones or kind of competition thresholds over on the left here. So let's say again, you've got a stand of nearly pure cedar. You go out and you measure the average diameters with your diameter tape, and the average diameter is 27 inches. What this chart tells you is that if this stand has more than 75 trees per acre and the average diameter is 27 inches, it's at that upper end of the upper Goldilocks zone, and you probably want to think about thinning that stand out to keep the remaining trees in optimal growth. So I want to go through this again, and let's use this Douglas fir table to determine what density to thin a particular stand to. So we used the previous one as an example to show when you should when you should thin. Now I want to show you how to use this table to determine what density to thin down to. So let's say again that you have a stand of Douglas fir that's averaging 12 inches in diameter. You go out and you put in your plots, your 20th acre plots, and you determine that the average density is somewhere around 200, 225 trees per acre. So looking at the relationship between trees per acre and average diameter, you look across here and it shows that now you're getting into the beginning stages of the danger zone. This stand is too dense for the average diameter, and you want to thin it. So you want to thin down to the lower end of the Goldilocks zone, kind of getting it back down to a good growth phase. And again, if that average diameter is 12 inches, somewhere kind of in the middle here, what that tells you is that you want to be thinning down to roughly 125 to 150 trees per acre. So that's the way to use that chart. And again, these charts, as well as charts for red alder, western hemlock, grand fir, ponderosa pine, are all in the in this guidebook that OSU put out. So with that, that's my presentation on density management, and I am going to click out of here and see. Yeah, Lauren, how did we get any questions as I went through that? Let's start with those first.
Yeah, we have a couple different questions. So Scott mentioned, he said, I see a lot of DNR forest stands that look like the super high height to diameter ratio photo in Kirk's presentation. Does anyone know if DNR simply does not invest in the labor required for thinning?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've got a DNR stand right next to my Oakville land, and I'll admit I've trespassed and gone in there and put plots in to be like, what is going on here? These trees are extremely tall, extremely small diameter, and I think depending on where these stands are, what the DNR likely is doing is, carrying that stand out to just, absolutely the sort of the last possible moment, kind of nudging it up into that danger zone of the relative density chart to squeeze as much, volume growth out of it as they can before they finally come along and clear cut. Um, so, one little nuance that I didn't mention here, but I'm glad this came up is depending on how much land you have, you can really play with relative density across your various stands for different outputs. If you want to grow much higher quality timber that has, tighter rings in it, you may want to manage a stand at a higher relative density. If you want to manage some stands that just put a lot of meat on the hoof, and you're really into just producing, timber volume or sequestering carbon, you want to be managing to a little bit lower relative density. So I, have to kind of guess at what the DNRs. The other thing that I suspect is that a lot of DNR forests um, are managed using growth models, and the growth model probably didn't say, hey, unit 27 in the Harris tract needs to be cut now, and they're waiting for a computer to tell them what to do. So, given how much land they have, I'm not sure if they have, foresters out there looking at, every square acre on a real regular basis. Um, my speculation entirely. What else we have, Lauren?
Yeah, so there are several more questions. So one more is Marth made a comment that says, what I would like to hear eventually is we have three inventory reports, 5 years apart, five stands of conifer hardwood mix east of the Cascades. This is approximately 400 acres of critical areas inside our 20-year old development, about 1,500 individual homes, no timber harvest. We have about 150 trees per acre and an average BA growing to around 250. The relative density calculation um, is divided. Oh yeah, and then the uh, formula for that. Is this reasonable and a current practice?
My cold addled head may not have followed all of that, but you
Can I
mentioned
help?
a basal area BA of 200. Is that right?
250. But Martha, did you
250.
say that you wanted to clarify?
Yeah. First off, if I said east of the Cascades, I meant west. We're down towards Redmond. Um, and so we have, for one, we're not growing timber. This is a big development that has 400 acres of forest within the development, and a fair amount of it is wetland. And we had three inventories done 5 years apart, and the relative density calculation that they did was average basal area divided by the square root of QMD.
Yeah.
Is that commonly used? First off, it doesn't seem to be dimensionally correct.
Yeah. So what that is Curtis relative density, um, which is another way of calculating relative density. It's a little more complicated. That's why I didn't want to get into it in this conversation. But QMD is the quadratic mean diameter. So it's essentially the
Right.
average diameter of the tree of average basal area in the stand, just to kind of tease that formula apart. So it is a perfectly valid way, and probably in more production forestry, the most common way of calculating relative density. It can be used in any kind of stand, whether the stand's being managed for timber production or not, but perfectly valid approach.
But how is it not dimensionally correct? Because your ratio is a percentage, and the above the line is square feet per acre, and below the line is the square root of feet dimension, which doesn't make any sense at all dimensionally.
Yeah, I'm not prepared to answer that at this point. It's gonna be kind of a long answer, but two things I would recommend. One is look up Curtis relative density, and that will explain the formula.
Okay,
And if you want, you can send me an email, and I can send you a couple papers on Curtis relative density.
okay, but that's an accepted way of doing it still.
Yeah.
Okay, and what's your equation was trees per acre divided by uh
So for
average
my relative
diameter.
density, there's no, I didn't present a formula for it. There's no, it's a relationship between trees per acre and average diameter, but there's no equation in that. It's purely relational to each other. So the only
So how do
equations I
you get an
provide,
answer if you've got the inputs?
um, it's a good question. You're pointing at a tender spot in this Oregon State University publication where they're a little vague at how they arrived at those charts. And it's a combination of Curtis relative density and, to be honest, a little bit of fudging to come up with the tables that are in that guidebook. But what they were attempting to do was create a system that a layperson could use by just going out and, again, measuring trees per acre and average diameter, which is, very accessible to most people, and then look at these charts.
Yeah,
So it's a little hard to dig into exactly how they arrived at those charts. It's a little bit of a black box.
that's
Um,
all right. That's interesting.
but you're you're pretty sharp to notice that. So.
But when they describe the ratio, relative density, it's basically your current measured basal area per acre divided by a full basal area per acre when your trees are fully grown out. So what I was looking for was like a handbook of chemistry and physics where you go to a page and you look up mixed conifers with hardwood on the west of the Cascades and use the number 370.
Yeah, so that's the other thing is it's relative density, especially Curtis relative density, is most useful in even-aged stands. The whole concept of relative density applies much more cleanly to even-age stands
Okay.
that are a single species. If you have a mixed species stand, then a couple of things. One is I would encourage you to look at more, again, the biological clues within that stand, which
Yeah.
trees have low or small live crowns. Or you could, again, look at average diameters in there and then start averaging the relative density of each species to kind of see where your sweet spot is. But that's a little more complicated. And I do want to get to other people's questions if
Yeah. Thanks.
you bet. What else we got, Lauren?
Yeah, so Esther asked, what is the risk of thinning too early, i.e., before trees are showing poor crown ratio or HDR? Why not thin before these trees are stressed? And then Scott did take a stab at answering it. And he said one thought is that thinning too early increases the risk that an unanticipated natural thinning event, like a windstorm, might result in a drastically sparse stand and cause thinning regret.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. And I also want to be clear that the guidance that I'm providing here is thinning before the trees get too stressed. So, there's kind of a balance to strike between optimizing growth and running the risk of competition. And that risk can be either reduced growth or stress on the trees. And that's where, again, if you're looking at that kind of simplified relative density chart, that Goldilocks zone is, again, where you want to kind of keep your trees. But the idea is, again, to thin before either your growth curves really start tapering off too much, and or excessive competition stresses the trees out and makes them more susceptible to other issues. Now, other questions?
Marth also asked, why thin to the bottom of the Goldilocks zone?
That's really if you want to be optimizing timber production. So you're going to pull out, a fair amount of timber volume and drop it down to kind of this really exuberant growth phase. That's going to mean that each of the trees that you leave behind have ample room in the canopy to get plenty of sunlight and either get back in or stay in an optimal growth phase. And you'll pick up a certain bias in my presentation here, and that is, I am leaning a little more on timber production in this case, and using relative density to manage for both, either timber production or carbon sequestration. Again, if you have other values, stand structure complexity, wildlife habitat, things like that, you'll be thinning a little bit differently, but still want to be mindful of competition just to keep your forest, resilient and healthy. But some folks will thin down to a relative density of 35. Some will thin a little bit higher and keep their stand at a little bit under a little more competition. That can slow growth down, produce a higher quality tree. It also won't open the canopy as much, keeping it at a higher density. Then you've got shade that'll continue to suppress, a lot of the shade intolerant invasive species. So, there's at some point this really gets into the art of silviculture, very stand specific.
Hi, Kurt. I just figured I'd clarify the question a little bit. I appreciate the answer that was given in the chat, but it seems like you clarified that a little bit with saying that this is really about maximizing timber growth and harvestability. But I guess my question was, why wait until you're in that Goldilocks zone where seems like, at least from your presentation, you're actually seeing stress on the trees. And if your main goal is diversity and wildlife and other things as well, when is it too soon, maybe, is the question.
Yeah, I'd say the only or one of the main drawbacks to thinning too soon, is that you're not optimizing the overall growth rates of the stand. Using a terrible analogy that I really need to find another corollary for, the carrots in the garden analogy. You don't thin your carrots too early because you don't want to eat a spindly little carrot. You want to keep them growing so they plump up and then harvest them. And you also again want to manage the density of those carrots so they're not stressed out. And that's where again there's a range here to thin to depending on objectives. So with a forest, again, that Goldilocks zone, there shouldn't be too much stress on the trees. I mean, they are the dominant trees will be suppressing some of the other co-dominant intermediate suppressed trees, what have you, in the stand. But keep in mind that naturally regenerated stands are going to go through this kind of self-thinning phase, also where there's just inherent tree mortality, and this kind of density management is meant to control that mortality within the stand for whatever our purposes are. So it's not doesn't run contrary to our purposes. And again, mortality can be very valuable. Creates snags for wildlife habitat, down logs for wildlife, right. Mast for mushrooms, insects, etc. So again, I encourage you to not take anything here too literally. but use these as guides and then filter them through, your own objectives. Happy to keep taking questions from the chat, or just, open this up. If anybody wants to unmute and share some insights or questions. And I know we're kind of closing in on 8:30. I'm happy to stick around for a little while yet for, folks want to keep chatting. So,
Yeah, I have one question. The table you were showing of um, average diameter versus density. If you start thinning, your average diameter is going to probably go up. So you were showing going from 12 inches down to 11 to 13 inches. It's possible if you're probably going to thin the smaller trees and your average diameter would go up. So you got to keep that in mind.
yep. Yeah. Any other questions from the group, or Lauren, if there's anything in the chat?
Yeah, I don't think Jonathan is still here, but he asked if there are any studies that correlate the level of thinning with wind throw resistance.
I'm sure there are, and I'm sure years past I've looked at those. What we've kind of translated, both those studies and just our experience to is when you get into the second and subsequent thinning phases in a forest, the first being presumably pre-commercial thinning, but now you're getting into your second and your ongoing kind of series of thinnings. We generally recommend that you never thin more than 30% of the stems in a forest, and that is if that forest, is again largely dominated by a single species, Douglas fir, alder, what have you. That 30% breaks down a little bit when you get into more kind of complex stands that have multiple cohorts, multiple species. But the reason for that light thinning is to maintain the wind firmness of that stand. In other words, if you thin more than 30%, you really can set up the stand for a higher rate of wind throw during the first, usually kind of 3 years or so post thinning. It takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years for trees to firm back up again and be stable during, or more stable during, wind events. So that's when we write our prescriptions. That's usually what we're targeting, that 30% stem reduction.
One other quick question. Can we get a copy of what you presented today?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we put all of these videos up on YouTube, and so we have, boy, I don't know, probably several dozen fireside chats on our YouTube channel now. So if that's accessible to you, Lauren, how long does it take to get these up on our YouTube channel?
It depends. Sometimes very quickly and sometimes a little longer. But I can go ahead and I'm gonna try to get this one up because a couple of folks contacted me to let me know that they couldn't be here tonight, but
Okay.
want to see the fireside chat. And so I'm gonna get the this and the other most recent one up in the next week or so.
Okay. And then I'd also say, if anybody wants to email me, I'm happy to send the presentation to them. I have a lot of notes, speakers notes in there that provide, the commentary that you wouldn't get if you're just looking at the slides alone. So happy to directly email it to you.
And then in our most recent newsletter, some of those same resources were listed at the bottom as well. Or some of the papers that Kirk mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah, again, the two that I recommend is that USDA Forest Stand Density Guide and the OSU Managing Competition in Small Woodlands. They're just fantastic. And for, again, the layperson, really all you need to know to get a good handle on density management. Well, any other questions? Again, happy to stick around a little longer, or if that's it. Thank you all again for joining us for another fireside chat. And I have no idea what the topic is going to be next month, but I look forward to finding out, and we'll let you know in the coming weeks.